Excited that we were able to get together for our first Trainee Hub meeting. So the Trainee Hub, as many of you know, is a brand new initiative here at the center that we're very excited about. And the whole premise around establishing this hub is to start enabling our trainees to learn about the foundations, ethical dimensions, as well as planning for community engaged research from not only community partners and researchers, but also from amongst ourselves. We have a great deal to share with one another. So I'm very excited today to actually be introducing Shannon Black as our speaker for the session. So Shannon is the lead coordinator of academic initiatives at the Center for Community of Partnership at U of T. She's a post-secondary researcher, educational developer, as well as program coordinator with years of experience researching, publishing, and teaching on issues related to creative labor, digital media, as well as feminism, qualitative methodologies, and community engaged learning. She's also taught courses and provided instruction in the areas of academic writing and evaluation, professional experience, and mentorship. So Shannon's primary aim is to support larger goals to make a positive impact, particularly in the areas of community and arts-related education and research. She holds a PhD from the Department of Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto. So I'm really excited to be welcoming Shannon to today's session, and I'm going to hand it off to her to speak with you about community engaged learning and research.
Thanks so much, Priscilla. Can everyone who is in the room and online see and hear me okay? Yeah, I'm seeing nodding in the room. Maybe I can just get a reaction either in the chat or just one of the reaction buttons for folks that are joining online. Okay, thanks so much. All right, and just so you know, I'm going to be working on multiple screens as I deliver this presentation. So if I'm pivoting back and forth, that's kind of what I'm doing. All right. So thank you again so much to Priscilla for inviting me to be a part of this conversation with you today around community engaged research, but we're also going to talk about community engaged learning. And I'm going to parse apart the differences between the two as the presentation unfolds. But before we begin, my understanding that this is a smaller group, so it would be wonderful if you would feel comfortable just putting your name in the chat and maybe sharing with me what discipline or degree you're coming from or you're currently enrolled in, and maybe if you've had any experience with CEL or CER. This could be in the form of perhaps a course that you took while doing your study, your post-secondary studies, excuse me, or perhaps it's a research project that you've been a part of, just so I can get a sense of where folks are joining us from today and the level of familiarity with the subject matter. So as you're doing that, I'll do some housekeeping. So again, we've just done a bit of an access check to see, to make sure that you can hear and see me okay. If anything changes throughout the presentation, feel free to message Priscilla directly or to let us know in the chat, and we'll try to address that right away. Also, before I get started, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I am grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. As Priscilla mentioned, I'm from the Center of Community Partnerships, and for those of you who might not be familiar with the CCP is a central institutional office at the University of Toronto that specializes in community engaged learning and community engaged research. As a center of excellence, we provide training, convene networks and communities of practice, develop resources, we share knowledge and experience, and offer consultations to help deliver and enhance CEL and CER initiatives across the university. We also provide co-curricular initiatives in CEL and CER for students that are based at the St. George campus. Hi, Julia, nice to meet you. Thanks for introducing yourself in the chat there. So for our workshop today, we're going to be together, I believe, for about 70 minutes or so. And my hope is that we're going to talk through some of the ideas, theories, and activities related to CEL and CER. And by the end of this workshop, my goal is that you will be able to reflect on some of the context for community university engagement, identify and articulate the key features of CEL and CER, and explore good practices for engaging community partners in CEL and CER initiatives. And hello, Rebecca, nice to meet you too. Thanks for your information there. Oh, I should also mention, so the format of the workshop today will be a combination of me talking. There'll also be some opportunities for some reflective writing for yourselves. And then my hope also is for us to engage in some discussion. And so along those lines, maybe let's jump into some general questions to kind of get the wheels turning a little bit about about the way in which you see what the public purpose of your discipline is. And maybe how teaching, which is kind of the pedagogy part of things, or research as an activity advance this public purpose. And here you don't necessarily need to think about your teaching, because some of you may or may not have teaching experience at this point. Or you don't necessarily need to think about your own research, but rather think about how your discipline typically connects research and learning to its public purpose. And you can feel free to raise your hand and bring your voice into the space, or to drop some comments in the chat. Any thoughts on the public purpose of your discipline?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a voice. Excuse me. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
So I come from an epidemiology background. So the public purpose with us is to improve population health and reduce health inequities. And then research, well, my research specifically tries to improve maternal and child health.
Wonderful, thank you for that. And sorry, your name was?
Andy.
Hi, nice to meet you. And thank you for those of you who are introducing yourself in the chat. So, and I see that there's some activity coming up in the chat.
So I can go next, Shannon. So
Sure.
Many of you might or might not know, I'm actually a trained medical anthropologist, and a great deal of my work centers on women's health and HIV, previous to coming into this role as the community engagement and knowledge mobilization specialist at the center. And I think the public person of my role as a medical anthropologist has been around advocacy and drawing awareness to the unique health needs of women living with HIV and the need for women-centered HIV care across the country. There's pockets of it being done within urban centers. Geographically, I've done a great deal of work in the Maritimes, so I can confirm that. And now a bit more here in Ontario, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And ways in which we've been mobilizing these public purposes has been through echo models of training clinicians, as well as community-based organizations, of how to identify and understand a woman's lived experience, trauma that's associated with that experience, and ways in which we can be navigating their concerns through the healthcare network.
Thank you for that, Priscilla. I'm seeing some other comments in the chat here also around bringing results and transferring those into action, so it has a positive effect for the population that that this individual is engaging. Again, also seeing the kind of the role of qualitative methodologies and bridging the gap and drawing these methodologies more so into the work and mixed methods research. So that's great. So that's starting to get us kind of thinking about what role does our discipline play in the kind of quote unquote public realm, and what is the connection, and kind of moving into a discussion around a connection between the community and the university. So let's dive into that a little bit now, but please feel free to keep your reflections going in the chat as I speak. So let's start by establishing a definition for what I mean when I'm talking about community. And here I'm going to draw on a definition that was devised by Access Alliance, which is a community health agency here in Toronto. And it's also a leader in community-based research. And so for them, they define community as a group of people sharing a similar background or experience. And that background or experience, they further kind of tease out by suggesting that this could be tied to geographical location, so a city, a neighborhood, a classroom. It could also be tied to professional experiences. So for example, all of you as trainees as part of this program can constitute a community. And community can also be identity-based. So people who share the same gender, race, class, sexual orientation, immigration status, language, ability, and so on and so forth. And what I like about this definition is that it emphasizes the way in which community is always a social construction, and it is always, therefore, enmeshed in power relations. And I think this definition is also helpful because often the word community can oversimplify what communities are. For example, if we're talking about community, we might also consider what kinds of communities we end up working with in CEL or CER contexts. And for example, we might partner with small to medium-sized grassroots organizations, or we might partner with larger nonprofit organizations. And importantly, these organizations that we end up partnering with, the communities that they engage in, or that they represent, excuse me, may not actually be made up of the community members for which they are advocating for, if that makes sense. And so I think, again, what this definition encourages us to do is to be mindful and reflective about the ways in which we conceptualize and mobilize the term community, again, particularly in our CEL and CER work. So with that kind of concept of community in mind, let's go one step further and talk about a definition of community in relationship to community university engagement. And here I'm going to draw on a definition by the Carnegie Foundation, which is involved in classifying higher education in the United States and elsewhere. And they also have a community engaged institution designation. And this is how they define community university engagement. They say it's the collaboration between institutions of higher education and their communities, which can be local, regional, state, national, or global, and the mutual beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. Now, if we look at the two definitions, the Access Alliance definition and the Carnegie Foundation definition, you can see that they are defining local communities in a spatial way, but the Carnegie Foundation perhaps less expansively than the Access Alliance definition that we just reviewed. I also want to name here that the Carnegie Foundation and the Carnegie Wealth was established on the land of Indigenous peoples and the forced and unremunerated labor of many marginalized communities. The second quote here is from a recent article by Andre, Changefoot, and Levko, who also note that community university engagement is both an epistemological and a methodological approach. And we're going to explore both of these together today. As we talk about community university engagement, and we think about, again, the public purpose of our discipline within communities, whether it be in the context of CEL or CER or otherwise, I want to acknowledge that this framing explicitly positions the two in a binaristic way. And it's as though the university and its members are not always already part of various communities within the university and without. And so in this way, I acknowledge that this framing of community university engagement may be problematic in its binaristic framing. That said, when we think about community university engagement, it's also important to remember that there can be distinct power imbalances between the institution and the communities that universities engage, particularly in research and experiential learning contexts. For example, if we look at the history of community university engagement in more North American contexts, universities have a long history of reinforcing elite and exclusive approaches to knowledge and ways of knowing and being which exclude the knowledges of many communities. Universities also have established fields of study and have trained professionals directly tied to colonialism, racism, ableism, eugenics, discrimination and violence against sexual and gender diversity. Universities also have a long history of unethical approaches to research, including experiments on marginalized communities. And finally, universities are typically inward facing, meaning that overwhelmingly the investment is in the academy itself over the communities that they are a part of or engage in as part of research and experiential learning experiences. So with that in mind, let's now turn to talking about community engaged learning and community engaged research in particular. And I'm going to first start off by providing some context and a definition for what I mean by community engaged learning. Again, that pedagogical approach. So CEL is situated within a broader context of experiential learning, or EL. And this is maybe a term that you're quite familiar with. Again, for those of you who maybe have engaged in an experiential learning course during your time at university. But EL includes a wide range of practices and a whole bunch of things, such as co-ops and internships. It includes field work, lab work, and field trips. But the common thread across all of the different formats and models of EL is that each engage in direct experience and focused reflection in order to generate learning. And now within this larger umbrella term of experiential learning, we have community engaged learning, which is a form of experiential learning that takes place specifically in partnerships with grassroots, nonprofit, and public organizations, or with communities and community members themselves. Now, sometimes in the literature, you'll see CEL referred to as service learning, and sometimes it's used interchangeably with CEL, and sometimes it is used as a form of CEL. And this is particularly with the literature emerging out of the United States. So if you're, if you wanting to learn more about this, or this is an area that you would like to pursue, searching service learning will often result in many more hits in your research. But I also want to highlight that at the University of Toronto broadly, but also at the CCP, we've tended to move away from the terminology of service learning because of its unidirectional and charitable implications. And instead, we prefer the language of CEL because it emphasizes engagement. Because the term CEL, as I've just articulated, can be used quite broadly and sometimes interchangeably with SL, at the CCP, we've developed a set of 4 criteria which we feel roughly establish the boundaries of CEL. So again, as I've already mentioned, the first one is that it takes place in partnership with community, grassroots, or nonprofit or public organizations. Here, I want to emphasize that CEL does not involve for-profit organizations. Secondly, CEL responds to community-defined priorities. Third, it's reciprocal, meaning that both the community partner and the students in the context, again, of CEL benefit from the engagement. And finally, students involved in CEL undertake a process of reflection that connects their community engagement to the learning outcomes and initiatives of the course. And often that reflection takes shape in the forms of assignments and assessments. Lori Britt, in her piece on typology of service learning pedagogical frames, which was published in 2012, outlines that the following rationales or goals of engaging a CEL approach. So this is the why of why we might take this approach in our pedagogy. So first, she suggests that CEL, much like experiential learning more broadly, enables students to develop competence and self-efficacy through a process of doing. Reflection, as I mentioned just a moment ago, plays a critical role in the skills development and fostering critical thinking about subject matter that students are engaging inside and outside of the classroom. She also offers that CEL encourages students to explore what it means to be and relate to others in community. And what this does is that it raises critical thinking about social issues more broadly. Again, reflection plays a key role in putting those connections together and prompting students to consider their values and their responsibilities as members of society. And finally, she argues that with its emphasis on reciprocity and its focus on working with, again, grassroots, nonprofit, and public organizations, CEL in particular creates space for students to work with others to transform systems of oppression. And in doing so, it seeks to develop, again, a critical consciousness about the complexity of social issues. I should also note that this typology, like many typologies, is an oversimplification, and why we might engage CEL as a pedagogical approach lies somewhere in the overlap and perhaps somewhere in the middle of these three rationales. And if we look at a course here at the University of Toronto, we can see that kind of meshing and dovetailing happening. So, for example, this is Professor Michelle Arnaud's course on the role of pharmacology and toxicology in society. This is a course that she's been teaching for about 15 years here at the university out of the Faculty of Arts and Science. Michelle's course focuses on the physiology and pharmacology of drug use and misuse. And as part of the course, the students enrolled spend about 20 hours per term with community health outreach and harm reduction organizations. And again, as part of their work, they engage in reflection assignments where students are asked to connect their experiences with their community partners and the activities that they engage in their placements with the course content and objectives. And they do this again through reflection papers. They also have a really innovative assignment where they engage in debates with one another, again, to try to make those connections between what they're learning outside of the classroom and what they're learning inside of the classroom. And some of the learning outcomes that Professor Arnaud puts forward in the course is that she really wants her students to develop an ability to articulate social, economic, environmental, and physiological factors that affect people's exposure to substances. And equally important is that their students develop critical thinking skills for evaluating health and social policies. And for the community partner, where they benefit, and again, that's that reciprocity piece, is that they are able to access new research on street drugs that students then present back to harm reduction practitioners. And so if we think back to Britt's typology, we can see that this course might fit into the skill set, practice, and reflexivity rationale on one hand, as well as the civic values and critical citizenship goal on the other. Okay. There will be time for questions. If questions do come up, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll try to address them. But I will make some time at the end once I'm done talking about CEL and CER to address any questions you might have. Okay, so now shifting away from the pedagogy of CEL, let's talk a little bit about CER, or kind of the research methodology part of this. So community engaged research typically takes place in collaboration between higher education or university and communities. Again, a term that we've just unpacked and troubled a little bit. So like EL, CER is a broad umbrella term, and there's different forms. So, and you might be familiar with some of these forms of CER. They can include community-based research, participatory action research, community service learning, and other forms of co-learning and knowledge mobilization. And all of these approaches have a range of terminologies and methodologies and theories for change associated with them. But for our purposes today, I'm going to focus more kind of narrowly on the CBR, or community-based research. So community-based research is an approach that involves active participation of stakeholders whose lives are affected by the issue that's being studied. And it includes them in all phases of the research for the purpose of producing useful results to making positive changes. Now, unlike more conventional approaches to research, which may be driven by a researcher who develops the questions, methods, and collects the data, writes and publishes the findings, or a researcher who may be the only person who participates in the research process at all, and the goal is to develop kind of a disciplinary contribution to knowledge specialists. CBR is community driven. And so this research, again, is kind of practically relevant to those who are engaged in the issue that is being studied and leads to their self-determination. Again, as I said, CBR is also participatory. So the community members and researchers equitably share and control the research agenda through active and reciprocal involvement in research design, implementation, and dissemination. And finally, it's action-oriented. So that means that the processes and results are useful, again, to the community members in making a positive social change and promoting social equity. Now, there are three kind of key functions of CBR that we can think about when we're thinking about CBR also. And the first is around knowledge production. And so one of the main functions of CBR is to gain new insights through systemic and rigorous research. And again, here there's a centering of community members as experts on the issues that affect them, where academics and policymakers, for example, or those with institutional or organizational power, are seen as collaborators and facilitators. And in this way, the research is very much a bottom-up model of knowledge production. The second kind of key function or hallmark of CBR is around knowledge mobilization. And here, the sharing and communication of what has been learned in ways that allow people to engage and really use those research results. And so again, this is not just about disseminating information, or in particular, disseminating it back to subject matter or disciplinary experts within the institution, but it's allowing for open engagement and end user participation, and through that having an impact to the folks that are actually engaging in this research, meaning that it has real world application also. And finally, there's this piece around community mobilization, and this is the third function of CBR. And what it does in its kind of most robust form is it builds stronger relationships among people so that they're better equipped to use the research learnings and gather and together to address pressing social issues. And here I just want to provide an example of what that looks like again, drawing upon Access Alliance. And this is a model that they use to show the ways in which they're using their research mobilization in order to address a multi kind of audience within their work. So here they have the policy, the organizational, and the community audiences all in consideration when they're thinking about the way in which they mobilize and their advocacy and research framework. I also want to draw your attention to another course here at the University of Toronto, because this is a CEL course that actually engages in CBR. So here we see a meshing of these two things coming together. And this is a city studies course that is taught at UTSC by Professor Ahmed Alawala. And in this course, there's 22 UTSC students who undertake a community-based research project that looked at the state of youth play opportunities in East Scarborough as part of the Youth Friendly Communities program. And So for the project that the students engaged in, they were broken into 4 smaller research groups, and they were tasked with such things as collecting data and making recommendations about youth play facilities, funding, as well as accessibility in partnership with local youth who were trained also in research approaches. So here we have students working with youth in the community to conduct this research. And what they were able to do with the data that they generated in the findings is that they were able to, the students and the local youth together were able to come together and present their findings to the Kensington, Galloway, Orton Park Neighborhood Action Partnership Committee. And what this allowed the committee to do was then to contribute to an application for youth-friendly community designation. And so they were able to get this designation through the work of the UTSC students and the youth embedded in the community. And one important finding that came out of this research is that while there may be many kind of opportunities for play within this particular region of Scarborough, that many people are not aware of them. And what this designation allowed them to do is to have funding and resources to raise awareness about these options within East Scarborough. So again, if we're thinking back about the 3 kind of hallmarks of CBR, we see how this initiative, this course, was community driven, in the sense that the request came from community organizations and they were looking for support with the application for this designation. And the students were able to come in and fulfill their learning objectives, but also support the community priority. It was participatory. UTS students and local youth and the community organizations all took part in the project, the running of the project. And thirdly, it was action-oriented in the sense that it was aimed at getting a youth-friendly designation and building research capacity and resources for youth and community partners within East Scarborough. The approaches we might take to working with community partners in respectful and reciprocal ways. So again, I think we've already started to talk about this, but maybe if we could just take a minute and just brainstorm on your own and jot down on a scrap of paper or on your computer, what have you, some key words that come to mind when you think about reciprocal and respectful relationships. What does that look like in your own work or what you've observed? So let's just take a minute, maybe try to come up with five words or so, and then if you would, you can populate them in the chat there. Yeah, so let's just take a minute or so to do that. This is great. I'm starting to see things coming in the chat here. Give it about another 20 seconds or so. So some themes I'm seeing are around empathy, this communication, transparency, working with partners to have equitable ownership of the data, shared ownership, giving credit. Some really good ideas here. Feel free to keep them coming as I move on to onto the next slide. So as some of the words that are and phrases that are being populated in the chat point to, some of the things that we want to think about when we're working with community partners and engaging with them responsibly is to understand that our community partners are co-educators, researchers, and experts. And this is, again, something we were speaking about in the open discussion a moment ago. And what this does is it centers and values the knowledge that comes from folks who are outside of the university and of people who have lived experience rather than just or only technical or academic experience. And this is, yeah, and so also thinking about the ways in which we're learning from and not serving our communities. And again, there's that emphasis around engagement as opposed to service. Approaching our partnerships with a model of solidarity and not charity. Reciprocity, the exchanging of something for mutual benefit, and always having the consideration of power dynamics and how those power dynamics shift and move throughout the course of a relationship with us. And this focusing on that first point about thinking about the ways in which the communities that we engage with bring expertise from their lived experience. In the literature, this is sometimes referred to as cognitive justice. And it focuses on how we understand different ways of knowing and being. And one of the key benefits of CEL or CER or CBR is this ability to reorient the ways in which we value knowledge. And in the case of CEL, for example, it's also asking students to reorient how they value knowledge. And perhaps, again, ourselves as researchers, how we value knowledge and how that knowledge is accounted for, as we were talking about earlier, within the context of both the academy, but also within the community itself. And this is particularly important, again, to emphasize, which we started to touch upon in our section on community university engagement. And again, your colleague Julia kind of put a pin on it very, very eloquently a moment ago. But we want to be thinking about how we engage community partners because of, again, this long history of engaging partners in problematic ways. And here in particular, I want to highlight 5 models of engagement that have been particularly problematic. And you might have seen in your own experiences or know of. So first is this idea of kind of framing the community as a petri dish. So as a site, an experimental site, and as community members as research objects. Another problematic model that has been used quite frequently is this idea of community engagement and as in a museum exhibit. So here as researchers and educators from the academy going into the community, but sitting apart from them. And again, objectifying the community members or organizations that we're working with and standing apart from the knowledge that is also coming from our communities and community members. Another problematic model has been approaching communities as a mine to be excavated and seeing communities as a site of extractable knowledge. And this is particularly resonant if we think about Indigenous communities and nations, for example. There's also there can be and there has been a tendency to engage in communities because there has been a thought that communities can be a site in which to generate empathy. So sending, for example, students out to work with a community that might deal with The unhoused, for example, might be thought of as a way, problematically thought of as a way to generate empathy within the students that are engaging with that community. And what that does is it instrumentalizes systems and structures of inequity and privilege, again, for the benefit and arguably good feelings of the students engaged in that. Again, I want to name that those students might not be excluded from the community with which they're engaging. And finally, communities have been problematically approached as a space of otherness. So again, that puts this, it reinforces this idea of a binary between the institution and the communities, assuming that students and researchers and educators are not already from that community or from the marginalized group. So as we've already been discussing earlier, that we can then approach this work, some of the ways that we can approach this work, and we can try to address, mitigate, causing more harm to the communities that we engage with, is to engage in anti-oppressive and asset-based approaches, and also to consider our own positionality as we do this important work. And I want to name here that while I'm identifying these and really just flagging them as approaches, that the work of anti-oppressive and asset-based approaches to CEL and CER, as well as the kind of the long investment in asking questions and investing in learnings and unlearnings around our own positionalities, warrants much more time and space and discussion and reflection than my simply naming them here in this workshop does. But that said, I do want to name them. So to summarize then, some of the characteristics or things that we would like to strive for in engaging our communities is to have a commitment to community identified priorities, a commitment to reciprocity, and a commitment to equity, reflexivity, reflection, and anti-oppression. And as I kind of hinted to earlier before, this is important for a myriad of reasons. But something that is present right now, and we are going through, have gone through, and they're continuing to go through, is this the issue of the pandemic. So as we move into working with our community partners, we want to think about that contextual piece and what are folks going through in relationship to different contexts. So I just wanted to just kind of put a pin in the pandemic for a moment. And the ways in which the pandemic might have affected some of the organizations or community partners that you end up working with. So specifically looking at the nonprofit sector, the pandemic has had a significant impact on the sector, which I'm sure you can imagine, which has resulted in widespread organizational closures. Right now, I think as of last year, we have about 60,000 nonprofit organizations operating in Ontario. Since the pandemic has been going on, about 1 in 5 of those organizations have closed. So that's just kind of to show the scale of the impact of the pandemic has had on organizational closures. There's also been a reprioritization of organizational activities as a result of the constraints that organizations have had to encounter because of the pandemic. And so many of these organizations have had to shift the types of services that they offer, and they may be addressing more broadly, like they may not be specializing in one area, but offering services in lots of different areas. Many volunteer programs where perhaps if you're doing a CEL course where your students might have gone and been placed with have been halted or significantly reduced. And also planning horizons have been shortened, which makes it difficult for community organizations to plan ahead. So that can impact both, you know, if you're working in a pedagogical CEL context, but also for your research projects. It can make it difficult to do some of that planning. There's also been a significant reduced capacity in staffing. 30% of Ontario nonprofits have had to lay off staff because of the pandemic, and this was a stat from last year. And these have also put strains on those who have remained. And so leaving them with less capacity to, again, support student placements or perhaps to support your research initiatives in the various ways that you're hoping for their contributions. Yeah, and just an overall kind of less capacity to do some of this work and to contribute to partnership building processes, which I think goes back to, I think, a point that Priscilla made earlier of ways that we can make this work as least burdensome for our community partners. What kind of work can we shoulder? What kind of support can we offer, whether it's time or resources, you know, financial or otherwise. And so really thinking thoughtfully about the ways in which we are not burdening our community partners to engage with us as members of the institution. And finally, the last point I want to draw forward here is the pandemic, again, as I'm sure you can imagine, has heightened power and resource imbalances. Many of you, the federal supports, for example, that came through during the pandemic were not able to reach the kind of smaller grassroots organizations that we might be working with in the ways that those funding structures were able to support, for example, large organizations like post-secondary institutions. So being mindful of the ways in which, you know, the institution may have experienced the pandemic can be very, very different than the organizations and communities that we're engaging with. And again, the grassroots organizations in particular are having to kind of pick up the burden that's left. And